Everyone, welcome to Old News. My name is Laura Beth and I will be your host today. So we would love to hear from you. You can ask us questions and make comments by typing into the chat. I'll keep an eye on that. Before we get started, I do want to let you know that we have a couple of options for you to view captions for this video. You can click the button that says CC at the bottom of the video and view the captions on top of the video, or you can click that stream text link that I just put in the chat and you can follow along with the captions in another window. So we hope that you enjoy those captions if you end up using them. I'm going to put a survey in the chat at the end of the program just to see how well we did with our accommodations. And before I turn it over to Christian, I do want to give a quick shout out to one of our participants. Harris has shared with us an item, a mystery item that they found in a fossil dig, and they sent it to us with Old News to be identified. And so this is a picture of the item that Harris found. It's actually a dolphin vertebra, as Christian identified. And I did want to let you all know that if you ever find something outside that's like a natural object and you don't know what it is, you can always send it in to the museum through our Ask a Naturalist program. This is run by our staff in the Naturalist Center, and you can check out our video description to get a link to that service. So it's a really awesome thing. They will identify these mystery objects for you. And without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Christian Kammerer, our research curator of paleontology, who's going to share the news with us today and why it's important. And yeah, hi, Christian.
Hi, Laura Beth. Great to be here as always.
Are you excited to learn about or to tell us about Silurian superstars?
I am very excited about that. It's been a little quiet in the paleo news world in the past month, post-holiday lull, perhaps. So an interesting point of fact, January of 2022 was the first time in 7 years that we had a month pass without the description of a new species of dinosaur. And so I was going to say that we were in a dinosaur drought, but actually just yesterday, the first one of the year was described. So we do have our first dinosaur of 2022. This animal, Abdidosaurus kunai, found in northeastern Spain, which is one of these giant titanosaur dinosaurs from the very end of the Cretaceous period. So we do have dinosaur now. People can stop worrying. But we're not going to be talking about dinosaurs today. We're going to be talking about some very cool new work that's been done on a group of very ancient invertebrates. So this is a member of this group, a phylum called the echinoderms. So let's bring this up here. Look at some representative echinoderms. So echinoderms, it's a very species-rich and ecologically important phylum. It is exclusively marine. So these are animals that only live in saltwater in sort of the oceans and at best into like estuaries, maybe some brackish areas, but really saltwater animals. Some of them probably quite familiar to you. So things like starfish and sea urchins, among the best known marine invertebrates, sea creatures really of any kind. And also includes things like sea cucumbers and sea lilies, and then some of the things we're going to be talking about today. So echinoderms are very cool in a lot of ways. So they have this calcium carbonate skeleton. So making up things like their spines or their plates. And they have what's called the water vascular system that we'll talk about a little bit later. They're very weird looking animals to sort of our eyes as vertebrates. Among that, they don't have eyes at all. And they also have these very strange body forms. They have what's called radial symmetry rather than bilateral symmetry. So just to show what that is. So a lot of times animals like ourselves, we have our right side and our left side, and it's sort of like split down the middle. So the two sides, that's bilateral symmetry. So we have that. Things like insects, like this fruit fly, have that. A lot of things like worms and slugs, all sorts of animals are bilaterally symmetrical. But you can also have radial symmetry where the axes are split around kind of like a spoke pattern. So it's shown here in the form of a flower, but you can also get that radial symmetry in animals like these echinoderms. And a lot of times, especially, it's pentaradial symmetry, which means that it's a five-fold spoke. So like this starfish in the middle here, classic pentaradial symmetry there. And one of the groups of echinoderms that shows this really well is, and really tends towards that pentaradial symmetry, is this one up in the upper right-hand corner here. So these are the brittle stars. These are members of the class Ophiuroidea. And brittle stars, they're a wonderful group of animals. Maybe one of the more obscure of the echinoderms, but they're actually both very species rich and super abundant. So especially in the deep sea, there are vast tracts of the seafloor that are just blanketed with brittle stars that are feeding on detritus in the millions and possibly billions down there. So lots of these out there. So they're called brittle stars because they're quite fragile animals. They have these sort of long whip-like or almost snake-like arms, which is also the source of another one of their names, serpent stars. But the arms, they fall apart really easily and break very easily. So brittle type of animals. There are a lot of them that are just kind of, greens and browns, but there are some brightly colored ones out there, like the ones at the right that have sort of these vivid pinks to their body. Like I said, they're usually the pentaradial, the five-fold symmetry, but you do get some with more arms than that. Like there's a six-armed one in the upper right there. And there's this whole group, the basket stars, that have many arms. Are highly specialized brittle stars that are filter feeders. So their arms are broken into a lot of little branches that help them basically grasp bits of food or small planktonic organisms out of the water that they feed upon. So brittle stars, they really are, they're a very important group in modern marine ecosystems. So you might wonder, like, how are they different from starfish? They do, look a lot alike. They both, kind of these five-fold symmetry, star-shaped things. So a few ways to sort of immediately tell them apart. Starfish generally have, these big fleshy arms that all sort of connect at the middle, and it's not really distinct where one ends and the other begins. Whereas the brittle stars, they have this central disc, and then the arms are very discrete. They're very distinct structures that are separate from one another, and are distinct from that disc. And the disc in the brittle star holds all of its organs, whereas in starfish, the organs extend out into the arms. So just some quick ways to tell apart a brittle star from a starfish. With that in mind, Laura Beth actually put in a little quiz here for you. So we've got, with all that I've just said, I have two examples of some of these star-shaped echinoderms. So which one is the brittle star and which one is the starfish?
Okay, I think the one on the left is the brittle star.
Mm-hmm.
It looks pretty. It's kind of hard to tell. You don't see the disc in the center very clearly, but the ones on the right definitely look like they're all connected to the
Yeah.
center.
Yeah, I think that is a very fair interpretation of it. But actually, it's the one on the left is a starfish. The one on the right is a brittle star. So starfish, that's a member of a group called they are brissingids, which is these very specialized starfish that are sort of act like brittle stars. And
Tricky.
so it does look a lot like that. So what I'm trying to get at here is there's actually a lot of diversity in brittle stars beyond just sort of the simple differentiations. Okay, so I've got another quiz for you. One of these is a starfish, one of these is a brittle star. Which one do you think is which?
Oh no. Oh gosh, I wouldn't even think that the one on the right is a star.
Yeah, I mean, none of
A
them really
sea
look like
star.
what we typically think of as either a starfish or a brittle star.
I'm kind of, I have to say, I'm kind of looking at our chat to see if anybody wants to help me out. But Sam got the last one wrong too, so no help, Sam. Okay, I'm gonna say that I think the one on the left is a brittle star
Okay.
because it looks more like a starfish to me.
All right.
And I
So that
think
one
this
is a
is one.
starfish,
Oh my
and it's the one
gosh.
on the right that's the brittle star. The one on the left is actually a member of this group called the slime stars, which are deep sea starfish that exude huge amounts of slime. Um, and brittle stars generally not slimy. They're very sort of plated. But yeah, these look a lot alike. So what I'm just trying to get at with this little exercise is that there's a lot of diversity in the form, in the morphology of what these different echinoderms look like. And there's a lot of convergence between them. So you have to, the sort of the general rules of thumb aren't always going to help you. You have to look at some of the finer details of their anatomy to be sure to tell them apart. And so a few things that work to always tell apart a starfish or a sea star, as they're sometimes known, from brittle stars, have to deal with this structure called the madreporite. So I mentioned earlier that echinoderms have a water vascular system. So basically you can think of an echinoderm kind of like a water balloon. So they have a hydraulic system where they basically pump their bodies full of seawater and use that to move their tube feet. So they have these little structures called tube feet, and using muscular contractions, they basically pump water into them and then allow them to move around using the tube feet. And so they pump in in through, basically it's kind of like a grate on their body, that structure on the right, the madreporite. It's kind of like a valve where they can either pull in water or push out water, and help them move around. And so in a starfish, the madreporite is always on top of the animal. It's on what's called the aboral surface, which means away from the mouth. So the mouth is on the bottom and then the madreporite is on the top. In brittle stars, it's on the oral surface. So the madreporite is always on the bottom next to the mouth. So even if the overall body shape looks different than you expect for a brittle star or a starfish, you can tell them through that. Another related thing is that starfishes have both a mouth that they eat through, like most animals do, and then an anus that they excrete waste through. Brittle stars do not have an anus, so they just eat through the mouth and then also excrete through the mouth. So a strange way of life, to be sure, but clearly it's brought them a lot of success. So they're mostly eating, detritus on the seafloor, although, some of them also are filter feeders, like that basket star I showed earlier. And so also they, yeah, go ahead.
Can I ask a quick question from
Absolutely.
our participant? Okay, Sam wants to know, would you say that their tube feet are kind of like little jetpacks with water?
Jetpacks, I don't know. Like how even to describe them. I mean, I do think like hydraulics is what they technically are. So they're almost like little like hydraulic pumps of some kind. There isn't a great analog for them in terms of like things we humans use to get around. I guess like the closest thing would be kind of like some hovercrafts that inflate the bottom, usually with air to move over surfaces. But generally, we have our technological approaches are based on wheels on land or jets in the air. And so having something that moves thousands of like little bits to get forward just doesn't have a really, really good analogy. It's an incredibly slow way of moving. Like these animals are, they move definitely at a much reduced rate to most of what we vertebrates do. So like when a starfish eats a clam, for instance, and you see that on a nature program, it usually has to be sped up quite a bit for it to even like register as something happening. So if we need to get from point A to point B, we don't really want this thousands of little hydraulic pistons just creeping inch by inch over the landscape.
Mhm. All right, that's awesome. And we don't have to get into this because I know we don't have time, but spiders use hydraulics to move, right?
Yeah, so
Get
a lot of that is, I mean, that's a big digression. Basically, a lot of invertebrates that don't have, the same sort of muscular control, muscles attached to the skeleton for movement that vertebrates do. They have some sort of basically the cavity filled with fluids, and the motions of those fluids are related to a lot of locomotion. And so all of that is hydraulic to some degree. And but the water vascular system, sort of this pumping action throughout the body, is unique to echinoderms among all the invertebrates. And they do move at different rates. So like some of them do move reasonably fast. Like I mentioned, the starfish, you can see it's using the tube feet to really just like slowly creep there. But the brittle stars, they do have tube feet, but they don't use them for locomotion. They just thrash the arms around with muscular contractions. So they can actually move quite a bit faster than most of the other echinoderms. So there's some brittle stars in their usual habitat, just sort of crawling around the seafloor there. So we've spent a lot of time just sort of introducing the concept of brittle stars, which I think is necessary because they are, not super well known. Although there are, some of them are pretty popular in aquaria. But let's move into sort of the old aspect of this, talking about their fossil record. So in general, echinoderms have a pretty good fossil record. So, they have these calcium carbonate skeletons. Calcium carbonate is, preserves really well. So lots of the shelly organisms like mollusks have a lot of calcium carbonate. And if you go back to the Paleozoic era, the first part of sort of the age of complex life, there are all these, prehistoric echinoderms, especially crinoids. So crinoids are pretty rare today, but in the Paleozoic, they were everywhere. They were super abundant, super diverse. If you look at any of, art of the ancient seas, this is a diorama from the Illinois State Museum. It seems like seafloors were just blanketed with these almost like gardens of hundreds and hundreds of these sea lilies, these early filter feeders. And unfortunately, like the sea lilies, basically, they get hit really hard in the end Permian mass extinction and never really recover. And some of the earlier echinoderms, we've lost entirely. Like there's some very strangely shaped echinoderms from the early Paleozoic, some of which don't even look like they have the radial symmetry. So they almost look more bilaterally symmetrical, but unlike anything alive today, just sort of these very strange sort of plated structures. A few of them, like Gaugia in the upper right, looks more like what you expect an echinoderm to look like. But some of these other ones, you really just have nothing alive today, or even later in time, that really looks like them. So you've got, crinoids and their relatives all throughout the Paleozoic, some of these totally extinct groups in the Paleozoic. And then in deep time, we do have a lot of fossils of brittle stars as well. And best case scenario, you find something like this. So this is Aphiapetra, which literally just means snake stone, the genus name. And so this is from the Zollenhofen limestone, which is one of these Lagerstätten that we talk about a lot, of just the exceptional preservation. So this is the famous one from the late Jurassic of Germany. And, this is basically a complete fossil brittle star. And so if you can find something like this, you're in really good shape. But as I mentioned before, they are brittle. They do have a tendency to break apart after they die. So the majority of the brittle star fossil record is not made up of these complete skeletons, but is made up of the little bits. So like here's a cross section through one of the arms of a brittle star, and you can see there's some blocks of muscle in the middle, there's some spines on the edge, and then it's made up of these like ring-like plates. And it's these little plates, almost microscopic, that make up most brittle star fossils. So you can see there, There's a CT scan of a brittle star, and then an individual plate from one of the arms. So after the specimen, or after the animal dies, all these little bits, they disarticulate, they fall apart. And so the fossil record is full of all these little bits. And these include some of the fossils that we're going to be talking about this month. So these are fossils from the Silurian. So this is relatively early in the Paleozoic. These are animals that lived around 428 million years ago. And these are fossils that were found, the new brittle stars, on the island of Gotland in the Baltic Sea. So Gotland is there. It's part of Sweden. Really interesting geology of the Baltic in general. But so on these islands, they're made up of limestone from the Ordovician and the Silurian in the early Paleozoic. It has this very characteristic weathering style that forms these pillars called rauks on Gotland, and this is one from one of the nearby islands. And so these are, the limestone, is made up of basically calcium carbonate, and in rock form, and so it's filled with millions and millions of tiny fossils, microfossils, and among them are things like this. So this is an incredibly tiny fossil. So you can see that this is just the tip of the finger. This is actually the fingerprint of one of the scientists who described these new brittle stars, and these are what the fossils look like. So these are just, too small to see almost with the naked eye, just sort of dust sized. And so what's done is, chunks of this limestone are basically dissolved, and then the bits that are left are run through a mesh, and then we'll go through under the microscope and pick out anything that looks like a fossil. So they have to process a lot of, material and getting a lot of other things in there, but, every so often you'll find a bit of brittle star. And in this case, it turned out to be completely new species. They were able to identify just on the basis of these chunks of the arm, really. So, not everything is like super spectacular thing that you can put on display in a museum, but they're still of great scientific importance. And so for these two new species, they figured out were present in these limestones in the Silurian of Gotland, which they named Ophiopatagno and MULDE. So they differ in a lot of little features, but what's most interesting about them is that they are capturing the record of the MULDE event. So MULDE event is one of the mass extinctions in the Paleozoic. In this case, it was global anoxia. So that means in the seas, the oxygen levels dropped down to almost nothing in a lot of places. And so the animals that were living there, they can't breathe, they can't live. So they're dying off because there's not enough oxygen. So this is one of the minor mass extinctions. And I realize that may sound like a bit of a paradox there, but it's not one of the big five. So the big five are the biggest mass extinctions in Earth history, things like the end Permian event, the end Cretaceous event that killed the dinosaurs, those sorts of things. So it was bad, but it wasn't super bad. But it does seem to have had pretty major effects on the evolution of brittle stars. So looking at all of the fine details of these Silurian brittle stars, and just again to remind you that what we're looking at are plates from the arms that have disarticulated, they've fallen apart. They studied the evolution of this group, and so just assembled a lot of data looking at similarities and differences between all the brittle star fossils to figure out how they're related to each other. And they found out that these Gotland brittle stars, which are marked with the black and red star there on the tree, are actually some of the earliest relatives of the modern brittle star groups. So they're related to all of the living brittle stars. And in fact, they may actually be ancestral to all living brittle stars. So one of the things that the authors argue in this paper is that Ophiopatagno appears to be a direct ancestor of Muldaster. So Muldaster is the later form, it's after the extinction, Ophiopatagno is before the extinction, and they are similar in enough ways and are close enough in time that the authors are arguing for direct ancestry. And finding ancestors has a long history in paleontology, but it's also, somewhat problematic in that there was a long time in paleo history where basically scientists were actively searching for ancestors, and every new fossil would be put into evolutionary sequence. So especially, in the early 1900s, late 1800s, when evolution was a pretty new concept and people were sort of like, very excited to find examples of it. Every new fossil was said to be the ancestor of this or the ancestor of that. So here's like a classic image of horse evolution, where horses through time get bigger and they get taller teeth and fewer toes. And so you find, okay, here's an older horse, so it must be the ancestor of the modern horse. And here's a yet older horse, it must be the ancestor of that one. And this isn't really how evolution works. So, I mean, there is, things do evolve from one thing into another, but it's a lot messier than that. So we now know that, rather than every prehistoric thing evolving into its descendant, there's a lot of side branches that go extinct. There's a lot of experimentation in different sizes and shapes. And so it's not just like the linear march of progress to the modern day. And that a lot of what were historically pegged as ancestors may be sort of like side branches rather than direct ancestors. With that said, it doesn't mean that there aren't direct ancestors in the fossil record. And so the better the fossil record gets, the more of a chance you have for finding those ancestors. It's just like when you're dealing with 500 million years of animal history, the idea that we are lucky enough to have dug up, identified the exact ancestor of certain groups, it becomes a bit presumptuous, let's say. But if you have thousands and thousands of specimens in a short period of time, then it gets a lot more likely that some of those are indeed ancestors. So in this case, they've got a lot of material and very good resolution of sort of the age of these things. So they make the argument, which, can't be sure of it, but I think it's a good hypothesis that this is a direct ancestor-descendant relationship between these two types of extinct brittle star. And what's interesting here is that it seems that the change in shape between these two is presaging a lot of what we see in modern brittle stars. And so this, especially after the extinction, so MULDE is a lot smaller and it's a lot simpler in terms of its plate shape than Ophiopatagno. And so this is probably due to what's called the Lilliput effect that we've talked about before. It's just like after an extinction, there are relatively few resources for organisms. So they are, they're not able to grow as large as maybe they traditionally did. Also, it can be beneficial for them to stay small and basically to grow fast, start reproducing quickly. So this can be a process called PAEDOMORPHOSIS, where basically the juveniles, the subsequently appearing animals, I should say, look more like the juveniles of their ancestors, or they start reproducing at, in juvenile style morphologies. So you might be familiar like with the axolotl. So this is an adorable salamander species that stays a larva and basically its whole life and reproduces as a larva. So it never has the quote unquote adult form in nature. And so if axolotls, were the only group of salamanders to survive and gave rise to a whole new group, then, they would be paedomorphic. And so the authors are arguing that this is what happened with brittle stars, is that modern brittle stars, which do have this very simplified plates, orientation, that they are descendants from these paedomorphic brittle stars like MULDE in this Silurian event, so that the entire, subsequent, pattern of brittle star history can be pinned back to this one extinction. And so, interesting to think about. Like it is, lucky, but that we could have like pinpointed that particular time. But there are millions of species out there, and there are a lot of fossils. So we're going to find these things in some cases.
Yeah, it just really blows my mind how rare this finding is,
Mhm.
especially for well, I'm just thinking about, our old news episodes. We got really lucky last month, right? We talked about a really rare occurrence of
Yeah.
finding a new Lagerstätten fossil site.
Mhm.
And this month, uh, it's highly likely that we found the direct descendant of, or direct ancestor, I should say, of modern day brittle stars. And has that ever happened on old news? We've been doing this for 2 years, and I don't think we've
Yeah, I don't
ever
I
talked
don't think
about that.
so. So we haven't like the fossils that are best supported as direct ancestors, like most of them have been known for a while. Like there are some that I think everyone would agree there are known ancestor descendant relationships. Like Australopithecus, the early human, is the ancestor of, our genus Homo,
Mhm.
modern humans. And so there's a exhaustively researched record of fossil humans. Anthropologists have spent a lot of time sorting that out. Um, that is also not totally linear. There are also side branches of early hominids, but Australopithecus evolved into Homo is very well established.
Mhm.
But that was essentially known in the early 20th century. That's not a it's not that's old olds.
Yeah, old.
So we haven't talked about many things like that. Especially since a lot of the discoveries that are being made, the ones that we've highlighted are of like totally new and strange groups that are not. Some of them have been very difficult even to fit into. Like remember when we talked about the Drepanosaurs, the Triassic animals with the big claws. Um, it is, paleontologists still don't even know where they fit into the tree of life, other than that, they're reptiles.
Mhm.
So a lot of these are, especially also if they've been just discovered, fitting them into the evolutionary tree is always going to be difficult. The findings are usually preliminary, and we're looking at years and years of study and sort of counter study by different groups of scientists to sort of settle on where they fit. So yeah, I think this is sort of the first like good ancestor descendant hypothesis that we've had on the show.
That's really exciting.
Yeah.
Um, and that explanation was really helpful for me, so thank you.
Oh, my pleasure.
We also had a good question, and this, I think me and some of our participants had a lot of questions just about brittle stars in general, so bear with us. But I was wondering, and Anne was also wondering, when a brittle star is still alive, does
Mhm.
it have to shed any part of its body? And can it, if like it's part of its leg gets chopped off, can it regrow part of its leg? This is while
Yeah.
it's still
So
alive. Yeah.
echinoderms have remarkable powers of regeneration. So, I mean, you may have heard like starfish, if you like cut off one of the arms, it can grow back the arm. And that's true of a lot of the groups. And I mean, it varies from species to species, but in generally, like brittle stars, yeah, they also can regenerate. Um, and they do, they can break apart even just like while you're handling them. Certainly, like when fish try to eat them, some of the arms might fall off, and then hopefully the creature is able to get away and not be just killed when it's eaten. But even like I mentioned that they're in the aquarium trade, and people have to be careful because you can accidentally just like snap off a brittle star's arm handling it
Mhm.
because they're very brittle.
Right. But they can grow back part of
Yeah.
those ossicles, I guess.
Yep. Yeah. So all the echinoderms, they have different forms of little plates or ossicles of calcium carbonate through the body. And so it's technically an endoskeleton. It's not really an exoskeleton because they do have a little bit of tissue over it. But brittle stars, it's kind of closest to the surface of all of them. You can see the individual plates and sort of the central disc like very clearly.
Gotcha.
Whereas in something like a sea cucumber that looks a lot fleshier, they still have the little ossicles and plates in there, but they're more of kind of a mesh sort of, or like scale armor type thing scattered throughout the body.
Mm. And I was also very curious about their eyes.
Mhm.
I know they don't have eyes, but do we know if any of the echinoderm ancestors did have eyes and then they lost it eventually, or do we know that they never had eyes to begin with?
So it seems like no, they didn't have eyes. And so there are some very interesting implications to that. So because echinoderms are the other major group of what are called deuterostomes, which are one of basically the two animals. There are a few sort of early divergent groups like jellyfish and sponges and things, but then most animal diversity is held in one of two major groups, protostomes or deuterostomes, which are distinguished by embryological features. It's basically how when the earliest part of the embryo is forming, sort of what hole becomes what, really. It's whether one thing is the mouth or the anus is what differentiates them. And so protostomes include things like insects and mollusks, and a lot of the worms. And then deuterostomes include vertebrates like ourselves, but then also echinoderms. So echinoderms are more closely related to us than they are to most of the other, sea creatures, shelly things. So they are, there are relatives, and yet they're so alien compared to us, with their radial symmetry, their lack of eyes, their whole deal, really. So a lot, and the other deuterostomes are also eyeless creatures. So weird things like acorn worms, we don't really think of that much, but they're important in their own right. So what this suggests is that eyes evolved independently between the deuterostomes that have eyes, like vertebrates, and the protostomes that have eyes, like insects. And that makes sense in some ways, but also if you look at the deep genetics of these things, especially people who are working on developmental genetics, how DNA influences embryos growing, a lot of the same genes are used in eye formation between something like a fruit fly and something, humans like ourselves. So there does seem to be this very deep genetic link in eye formation between different groups. Now, whether that indicates some deep ancestry of eyes or at least light sensitive cells, because also like there are a lot of animals that are eyeless but have, the ability to sense light because they have eye spots of some kind. So, like there are flatworms that have eye spots, but they don't have they don't have eyes that are able to discern images. They can tell whether it's light or dark, basically. So the DNA may just be based on having light eye spots at some point, or it could just be that those genes were co-opted for the same purpose because they were best at doing that. Like they had this underlying genetic architecture. Some were good at making sort of weird orbs that allow you to see, and some are less good at that. So this has all happened so long ago. The split between protostomes and deuterostomes goes all the way back even into the Precambrian, and that the fossil record is very limited there. Like the Precambrian animals we've mentioned a few times, like we don't even know what they are really. So a lot of this is based on sort of inferences, kind of just like figuring out based on what we're learning about the molecular biology, the DNA of the living things, and how they grow. So especially a lot of the classic lab animals like fruit flies and C. elegans, mice, stuff like that, looking at their embryos to figure out sort of what the very deep sort of patterns between the various forms of life are.
Man, that's so interesting. I feel like we have to have a whole topic about eyes. So, paleontologists out there, find some fossils and make a discovery that has to do with the evolution of eyes.
There were, one of the recent ones I thought about, there was a paper out about trilobite eyes. Trilobites, these very famous Paleozoic arthropods. Because there has been a lot of cool work done on trilobite eyes. They have these very, very characteristic types of eyes that are somewhat similar to other arthropods, where they're compound of a sort, but they are also their own thing. But I didn't choose that one, but maybe if similar work comes about in the future, we can get into that in greater detail.
Yeah. I think we have time for one or two more questions.
Okay.
So going back to our discovery, you mentioned that the two new species, they're highly likely direct ancestors of one another, and
Mhm.
the newer species, the younger one, um, was likely adapted to a different environment after the minor mass extinction event,
Yeah.
the MULDE event. So I'm wondering how were the changes to its body helpful in adapting to its new environment? Do we know?
Yeah, so basically, like the idea behind the Lilliput effect is there's limited resources. So an animal, let's just say it's an animal in this case, could also be a fungus or a plant. But the animal, it can't grow everything it wants to grow because it doesn't have enough energy, doesn't have enough food. So what is one of the most energy intensive parts of the organism? So there are a few things. The nervous system is super energy intensive. The skeleton is also very energy intensive. So just building bone, or in this case, the plates of these things, it requires consuming a lot of minerals, and then also, the energy to basically deposit those minerals as skeletal elements. So one of the things also, they're heavy, and so as a larger animal, you need more skeleton to protect you. Smaller animals, they can get away with invertebrates, more of that being cartilage, like really tiny things like the micro frogs that can like sit on your thumb, or like super tiny like shrews. Their skeletons are not as ossified as bigger things, so they've got more cartilage in them. So these, echinoderms, they don't have bone or cartilage, but it's basically the same idea. Is so they're lightening up the body and they're not putting down as much of the skeleton. So for these brittle star arms, they are simplifying them rather than having the full complement of all these little spines and plates that the ancestral brittle stars have. Is they're down to only a few of those, and maybe in the they're not as complex as they used to be. So, and this is what you see in juveniles of some of the earlier brittle stars as well. So the adult of Muldaster seems very similar to basically the early stage of development before it had been able to grow all the skeletal features that they used to. So yeah, it really just comes down to the resources. Like, we don't think that having, there probably wasn't direct selection of something about the environment that having a simpler arm made it better at like crawling through the muck or anything like that. That morphology then was co-opted by subsequent brittle stars into this, vast radiation of, modern brittle star diversity. But it's very unlikely, to me at least, that it was originally evolved like for that purpose. It's probably just, just a side effect of times being bad, hard times, call for
Yeah.
desperate measures.
Oh, man. Well, that's really interesting. And I'm going to sneak in one last question from Anne. This is about modern medical research.
Okay.
So, is there medical research being done to find out how regeneration works, like in order to help humans?
Oh, huge amounts. This is an incredibly heavily researched topic. And yeah, trying to regenerate things like lost limbs, or, lost eyes, or anything in humans, is, there are doubtless like thousands of people, if not more, hard at work at this all the time. A lot of it is like, and I'm sure people are looking at brittle stars and echinoderms. I mean, I know for a fact there's tons of primary research done on regeneration in starfish. I think the stuff for humans specifically is looking at various vertebrates that do regeneration, like salamanders are well known for being able to regenerate limbs and tails and things like that. Like lizards can also regenerate to a degree part of the tail, a lot of them. And so most of the studies that are specifically have medical goals are in those vertebrate model systems. But yeah, there's also a lot of work looking at the genetics and sort of growth patterns of regeneration across basically all the animals that we know do it and can be kept in a lab. Because so many creatures are basically die as soon as you take them out of their natural habitat. So it's very difficult for them to be model systems for this sort of research.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have for old news today. So, Christian, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. Everyone joining us from school or home or work, thank you so much for joining us. If you use captions today, we would love to hear from you to make sure that we're doing it well, doing it right. So go ahead and fill out that survey that I put in the chat, and mark your calendars, everyone, for March 8th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. That is our next episode of Old News. So we hope to see you there. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah,
Bye.
stay safe, everybody.